I've been working in the psychedelic space full-time over the last 4 years. I'm an investor in this space. We started Tabula Rasa Ventures in 2018 out of the Yale School of Management. Many people still recognize it as one of the first venture firms, if not the first venture firm for psychedelics. And since then have built out a lot of the infrastructure for this space. So we run the largest global conference in psychedelics. We were asked to host the first psychedelic series at Davos this year, so we're going to be going there and hosting the first psychedelic house of Davos, and started the first incubator for the space. I've helped capitalize dozens of companies and continue to build out this incredible ecosystem, working with nonprofit leaders, regulators, indigenous community members, policymakers, researchers, and everyone else who's important to making psychedelics not just another pharmaceutical, not just another care delivery treatment, but something that is making the world a truly better place as a community and doing it together. So I think that I'm a big fan of questions, I'm a big fan of interaction, so maybe we can just get like a few prompts or the things that people are specifically interested in having like touched on, and then maybe I'll give it back to Jim to guide the discussion and we can have a bit of a conversation through it.
So I'd say, like, if you give a brief background, the medical use case, and then kind of where, when you look, how you see it developing.
Okay, cool.
Can you just repeat that question?
Yep. So the first one was medical use case, how you see that developing over time. Maybe one more?
Any stories, specific stories of individuals that you've seen or you've worked with that
Gotcha.
had success with
That had success with psychedelic-assisted therapy. Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'll start on the story front, and then we'll kind of go to the medical use case. So what is super interesting about psychedelics is that this isn't something that's new and has taken place only over the last 4 years. These compounds were being developed and prescribed widely across the United States as well as the world back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and all the way up to 84. So we literally have had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients who have been prescribed LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA for things as varied as treatment-resistant depression to couples therapy. MDMA was highly prescribed for couples therapy, so if you're having trouble with your spouse, MDMA, right? And so there's this long history of psychedelics being used to treat mental health ailments, and a lot of the research that we had kind of in this mid-1900s period was unfortunately, some of the research wasn't done as well as it should have been done, and there were also a lot of political disputes around psychedelics. There were a lot of political conflicts at the time, especially under the Nixon administration, and so all of this was shut down. In the early 2000s, a man named Bill Richards out of Johns Hopkins begins to open up research again. There's a lot of great studies that begin coming out, and then as we get closer to 2020, around like 2016, 2017, 2018, now we have the first companies looking at that research, seeing that these compounds actually have the clinical data to be taken through the FDA approval process and become at least some sort of care delivery, both as a pharmaceutical and a therapeutic treatment, and we begin kind of this rise of the psychedelic industry, you could call it. But to kind of take it to the medicalized side of things and what they're being used for. So the psychedelic class of compounds is extremely varied. There are dozens and dozens of different psychedelics. So it's not like cannabis where you have one plant and basically the molecules that are in that plant. You have, psilocybin, which psilocybin to mushrooms is like THC for cannabis. It's the more psychoactive molecule within hallucinogenic mushrooms. But then you also have a bunch of natural and synthetic compounds that are all psychoactive. And certain ones like psilocybin have been shown to be really great for treatment-resistant depression. Other ones like ibogaine have been extremely effective for things like alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder. Ibogaine, not as many people know about, but iboga, which is a plant that is a West African shrub. Ibogaine is the active molecule in it. You can harvest it, extract the ibogaine, and basically have probably the most intense psychedelic experience you'll ever have, over 20 hours with people beating drums and keeping you in consciousness. But you will be able to transition out of an opioid addiction, and you will have no withdrawal symptoms afterwards. So we're seeing like extremely effective treatment happening with these compounds, and this is both in the underground, this is also in the above ground now, actually going through clinical trials at top universities. We're good friends with the folks at Johns Hopkins, at Yale, at Stanford, at Imperial College London in the UK. So all of these institutions now are opening up psychedelic research centers. We're actually helping university build out their first psychedelic research institute as well. And so we're slowly beginning to see this humongous mass wave of research really beginning to look at all of these different treatments. And we've seen things not just on kind of the mental health front of like an alcohol use disorder or treatment-resistant depression. We've also seen things like traumatic brain injury, like stroke, and things that wouldn't necessarily even be seen as mental health to begin with. So I guess that's a little bit on that front.
Just you talked about commercializing companies or ideas. Maybe just talk about one or two that stood out to you and what they were doing and how they found that product market fit.
Yeah. So the one of the examples, so that there's so many different things to look at here, because again, it's not just a drug, it's also all the infrastructure that's necessary. So a little bit of background on psychedelic assisted therapy, right? So what's really interesting about psychedelic assisted therapy, I'm not actually a big fan of pharmaceuticals. I don't use any sort of like regular prescribed drugs. I think, SSRIs have efficacy for certain patient populations, but for a lot of people they don't work. What I find super fascinating about psychedelics is that you can use them in a treatment over several different sessions, and then you can see results for years of time. So this is not something that you're taking on a regular basis like an antidepressant. The traditional psychedelics at least are not habit forming. Certain ones that are being classed as psychedelics like ketamine can be. But for the majority of psychedelics, non-habit forming as well. And so the way that psychedelic-assisted therapy has been structured is that you have three phases. You have a preparation phase, which prepares you for the psychedelic experience. You have the psychedelic-assisted sessions, which can vary. Maybe it's 3 psychedelic-assisted sessions, maybe it's 12. Typically how it runs is you'll do a psychedelic-assisted session, then you'll have a session of just cognitive behavioral therapy where you're just walking through and integrating that experience. Then you'll do the psychedelic-assisted again, and you'll just keep alternating those until that regimen runs out. And then the third phase is integration. And so if you go to basically, Burning Man for the year, you drop MDMA, you come back. If you're not doing it in a therapeutic setting, you might see results that last, a few weeks of time. You might have a really large shift in perspective, feel in love with the world, etc. But really, the integration phase is habitual patterns or practices that allow for you to integrate this kind of cosmic experience that you have into your everyday life. So like the simplest and kind of silliest one that I can think of that's not mental health related, but it's actually somatically related is, for instance, like one psychedelic experience that I had like a really strong like connection with like my feet. I was like, man, like my feet are like super, super important. I'm walking on them all day. I do not pay attention to them as much as I should. And like that kind of got me into this frame of mind where I was just thinking more about my body and also realizing that I was having like some serious issues with like my knee, my joints, and like things that were going on in my feet that then allowed for me to actually go and be better at applying different physical therapy, which could be seen as like an integration process in taking this awareness that I had, now being able to integrate. Now that's a pretty silly example, but for something that's more serious is perhaps you have a vision during a psychedelic experience that one that's been commonly described with like nicotine use and getting people off of nicotine is that you find yourself choking on a cloud of smoke during the psychedelic experience. You can't breathe. You feel extremely bogged down. Now, when you come out of that psychedelic experience, you might have those effects for just a couple weeks of time where it's like, okay, smoking is bad, but what is the actual integration that you're going to take to be able to do that? Some integration can be something like, just chatting with your therapist on a weekly basis. Other things can be, one that we were looking at with our firm is like, are there ways to combine environmentalism with integration? So can you be, watering a plant on a daily basis and doing a meditation around that, focused on just basically smoking cessation and getting off of nicotine. And then also there's a whole industry now of like apps that are helping people integrate. So that's kind of on the integration front. What are the habits that you are deploying in your day-to-day life to make sure that that cosmic experience can make things more long-lasting and can make those therapeutic effects last? On the preparation front, like an example of a great company that I like to give is we had a company exit that's a virtual reality company. And so like, what does virtual reality really have to do with psychedelic states? Well, what you can do is you can give someone a pair of VR goggles. You can basically provide them with a truly transcendental experience in one way or another, and you can have them practice different grounding techniques throughout that experience. And so that when they go into the psychedelic assisted session, they've already had this disorienting visual and auditory experience that they've practiced grounding through. And so that when they go into that state, they know how to ground themselves when they are, on another planet meeting the mechanical elves or whatever you meet in those other dimensions. So that can be super useful. And so really all of this to say, to the point of what's happening in the industry, it's not just the drug development. Our fund invests in 3 different verticals. We look at technology, we look at infrastructure, we look at drug development. On the drug development front, that's kind of more the clinical trials going through the FDA approval process. On the technology front, we're looking at some of that VR tech. We're looking at EHR health systems that fit really well with the psychedelic model. And then on the infrastructure front, we're looking at clinic systems, at media companies, at DA-compliant facilities, at manufacturers, and all of these other pieces, the picks and shovels, you could say, of what needs to happen for psychedelics to fully exist. So yeah, I'm gonna give it back to you, Jim. And,
That was really, you beat me to the punch, because I wanted to know what you invested in. So David, did you have a question?
Well, I was going to say, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about, on a global basis, what countries you think are the most progressive from a regulatory perspective. In the US, what states are the most progressive? And then specifically, since we're in New Jersey, where New Jersey is on the curve.
Yeah. So with state by state, I think this comes back to a conversation on cannabis. And a lot of people are thinking about psychedelics as cannabis, and so a lot of their questions are around like state by state. So I can answer those questions pretty directly. Like US and Canada, UK, and the beginnings of some other European nations are probably the most progressive in policy. In regards to states, we're looking at like Oregon is probably the furthest ahead in all of this. For us, the question is how much does Oregon really matter in the conversation of broad psychedelics? It really matters for psilocybin and for psilocybin-assisted therapy. But does it matter as much for ibogaine, for LSD, for any second-generation molecules that are formed off of the classics? So like there's a lot of other questions to ask there. So for us, actually, we don't invest in any companies that rely specifically on state-by-state legislation. If you look at the cannabis industry, that was actually a large failure. If you talk to any lawyers, the amount that you have to spend in compliance and regulation and taxes, et cetera, keeping up with state-by-state legislation and allowing for that to actually help your businesses succeed, it just doesn't make financial sense at the end of the day. Whereas when you're looking at a drug development market where you have the entire infrastructure for a new class of compounds and a completely new way of doing therapy, it's a completely different ballgame, and you're getting legalization at the federal level. So when MDMA, we're looking to have that legalized by the end of 2023, psilocybin by the end of 2024, MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD and psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. That will happen on a federal level. You'll be able to go to anywhere in the country, just like you can today for ketamine-assisted therapy. There's probably clinics 10 minutes away from here, get an infusion and be able to treat your depression through that modality. So I hope that provides a little bit more nuance to it as well.
Sure, just so that I make sure I understood that, all those things you described are in the pipeline with projected approval?
With projected, yeah. So we're at the end of MDMA phase 3 clinical trials. We got some of the first results from MAPS back in 2020, and they've continued that out. And I think it's been rolled out for compassionate use within the states at this point. So there's the first patient populations going through right now. So yeah, it's very likely that MDMA will be rolled out by the end of 23.
Thank you.
Yes, Kelly, go ahead.
So just to sort of go on a little bit of that conversation, would you be looking at I know you said that you're not necessarily looking at the legal side of things, but the policies that each state run into. So for example, 2019, Colorado decriminalized it. So are you looking at those states as sort of spearheading? I know Oregon and Colorado have been hand in hand with cannabis and all of that, but are you looking at those states to sort of take the lead on sort of spearheading the use of?
So yeah, definitely, and we pay very close attention to the policy. We just don't invest in companies that rely on state by state to be able to make their business models work. But the policy can tell you a lot. The policy can tell you, how is this actually going to be rolled out in treatment, as you're saying. So for instance, one of the things that Oregon is in the front lines of is showing us. So for instance, one big dispute has been there's no real conclusive evidence on microdosing right now. We have the foremost researcher in microdosing on our board, they've read every single paper out there, and they're saying, possibly, but there's no conclusive evidence to date, right? The researchers, the doctors, the therapists, all in Oregon are like, we don't want to include microdosing. The citizens, on the other hand, are like, give us microdosing, so it's like completely different. So the question of what people will want, what actually gets rolled out, who can actually deliver the therapies, what kind of training do you need? Does it have to be an accredited therapist, or can it be more of a trip sitter? Because we've had an entire underground ecosystem of trip sitters, and there's a lot of activists that believe that having trip sitters be kind of an entirely new economy, and being able to provide financial support to a whole new demographic of people that maybe can't get accreditation to become a licensed therapist or doctor is enough to be able to still deliver good therapy. So paying attention to that policy helps us then diligence companies and say, well, what is the likelihood that all of these, like if a company is saying, well, we're going to provide therapists with this specific type of clinical training and help them go through this, for us it allows for us to diligence that company and say, well, how likely is that actual accreditation going to be needed 3 years down the road, and will this company still be standing there as a result if this is the one thing that they're really offering. So it really helps us think through diligence in that way, but super important to pay attention to the policy. So yeah.
Okay, so you formed a VC fund. You probably did some fundraising. So I'm just wondering about the major fund investors like endowments or pension funds. Are they going into this?
It's still super early. That's why we're going to Davos. We're going to convince them to do it. So it's still early. So most of the investors, there are institutionals, but it's mostly family offices and angels. A lot of people from cannabis, a lot of people from crypto. Some of the biotech and life sciences folks are really beginning to take more note. And really, it's actually shifted quite dramatically in the last 6 months. When we were talking to investors, even like 12 months ago, things were still kind of like just the NY, like the New York Times articles were just beginning to roll out and things like that. In the last 6 months, we've gotten way more people who are becoming open-minded to it, way more people having their first psychedelic experiences and then beginning to speak to us about it. So I think it's changing. The investor profile is changing, but I think it'll be still probably a couple years before we get those large institutionals. And I think what's probably going to convince them is when they see psychedelics really merging with kind of big pharma as a class, whether that's through acquisitions or through being robust enough to stand their ground. I think like that's when we'll see some of those bigger players getting in. Yeah.
Edmund, go ahead.
Yeah. What's the patent situation with these companies that you invest in?
Yeah. Right. So. Patents are super tricky with classical psychedelics, right? Because it's been in the public domain forever. So for us, like we're also less interested in companies that are specifically focused on patent strategies around classicals, but second generation psychedelics. So one of the most compelling companies we saw on that front, anyone here who's had an MDMA experience, it's very much like highest of the high and then crash and burn, right? So like, how do you actually have that curve come down and have like a really easy settling down after you have this euphoric experience? Or how do you basically minimize and don't necessarily give someone such a euphoric experience that they're going around their office and touching everyone to something that's more manageable, positive, and also doesn't have necessarily that crash and burn. So there's a lot of evolution that's happening on compounds right now, and that's really where a lot of the patent strategy comes in. Then there's the whole kind of ethical conversation that's happening in the space around patents and psychedelics and compounds that can really improve humanity. And what is patents going too far? There were a lot of controversies around compass pathways. People kind of, I think that it was probably taken too far, but interpreting their patents, patent filings, some of the lines in there were basically saying, well, patents on a room with lukewarm colors and holding a patient's hand and things like that. Now, all of those lines basically stemmed on like a unique formulation and unique synthesis process, but there was a lot of aggravation, and there was actually an entire nonprofit group that formed to basically tear down just this one company's patent strategy. And that's another really important thing in psychedelics is there is a very loud and vibrant community. Like you cannot be in this space and not pay attention to the community and not be for the people. Like you will get torn to shreds because there are, a lot of very wealthy philanthropists, a lot of, long-standing organizations that have been fighting this good fight for a long time, and they will make it significantly more difficult for you. As the pension funds get in, as it goes from billions of dollars to tens of billions to hundreds of billions, the community will lose power, in a lot of ways, and the financials at the end of the day will win. It's just how it goes. For us, a lot of what we're trying to do is just make sure that that space remains within the ecosystem for community to still prosper, and that's being taken seriously. And also just continuing to really highlight how important the therapeutic modalities are, and not just the compounds themselves. So how important the integration process is, and that's what we're seeing in the research. It's not something we even have to do too much convincing of. The MAPS phase 3 trials that came out, one of the most interesting things that they showed was you can take the MDMA out of MDMA-assisted therapy, and just the therapeutic process that they've developed is still more effective than SSRIs. Okay, that's how good it is. So this is a revolution, not just in compounds, not in just chemistry. It's a revolution in how we treat mental health and therapeutic modalities in general. So yeah.
One question about what was your biggest investment so far? What investment are you so excited about that you've already invested in, or that you're investing in now?
Yeah. So I think that we had this, so Maria, my managing partner, other managing partners right over there, joining me today. So we just had this conversation yesterday. So one company that we've been super excited about has been a company called Terran Biosciences. So they have a few different components. They're doing some things in psychedelics, but they're also, they have a really great technology that is world-class in being able to identify early onset Parkinson's that they licensed out in Colombia. They have another compound that they have an entire patent portfolio around that's specifically used for the treatment of schizophrenia that's been shown to be super effective in the first phases of trials, and now they're beginning to do things with psychedelics as well, and we're seeing them develop. But again, they have a really strong patent strategy, really strong technology that's been rolled out, and now are beginning to experiment with psychedelics and build out on top of the arsenal that they've already built. So still super early stage. We were lucky enough to get a chunk of it in the earlier days. Today, it's pretty pricey, like many psychedelic startups. The market's quite hot. But we think that the team is really great, and are just I think that they're going to go far. We both think that they're going to go far. Other companies in the space that we're super excited about. There's a few companies that are doing really innovative stuff with the future of technology in the space and therapeutic care. So one company we recently invested in is called WavePaths. So they basically, it's coming from the top researcher in the world on the intersection of music and therapy. So this individual studied music at Imperial College London and rolled out an entire platform for music-assisted therapy, even without the psychedelics, and now they're actually using it for psychedelic therapy as well. What's super interesting about every clinical trial that's been done to date in psychedelics is that every single one has included music. So music is an integral part of the experience. It is oftentimes featured, and there are big differences. There's been studies to show that, for instance, more lo-fi, electronic types of music are more effective than classical. So sorry, Beethoven, you didn't make it into the psychedelic list. But, so we're seeing these really interesting differences between music and how effective it can be of actually significantly increasing the longevity of an individual's therapeutic benefits. And so, as we combine this world of spirituality and medicine, there's a lot of other interesting quirks, you could say, that we will find that will eventually become the foundations of preventative care and of therapy in general. So yeah.
Great, we're going to take one more question, but before I take the question, I'm going to ask Ellyn Ito to come on up. We have two entrepreneurs here who are in this space. Avani, Kanubaddi, come on up. We're going to shuffle here. You move over just a little bit this way. And what's one question from back there? Desiree, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll talk about valuations and business models.
Yeah, so we're very early stage, pre-seed and seed. So for us, a lot of it comes down to team, whether they've executed together before. We look a little bit at business models and partnerships, advisory committees, but a lot of it comes down to the people. And then we have a whole diligence process that's been developed in partnership with Cambridge University as well in the UK. So we do some of the drug development pieces through that as well, and have a really great investment committee that helps us diligence those pieces too. On the valuation side, right now, just kind of giving you layout of the market, we still are seeing, quite overvalued companies on anything that's late seed and afterwards. There's a lot of interest in psychedelics. There's more investors deploying than there are companies in some ways, and so there's a lot of overvalued companies. That's again for us. We've developed, our model is an accelerator model. I was building incubators and accelerators over the last 10 years, and so the way we work is basically we find entrepreneurs and we say, hey, we'll work with you for the next 3 months, we'll de-risk you, we'll diligence you, you'll give us some equity up front for that, and then after those 3 months, if you hit your milestones, then we'll write that first check and shop you around to every psychedelic investor that's out there, because that's our network. We're able to basically then match what traditional investor returns would be based on the carry that we're getting. But if you're just playing a traditional investing game, anyone who would be starting a psychedelics VC today, I don't think it's necessarily the best time. But public markets are down. We'll see what happens with the private market soon.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Ellyn Ito to talk to us about her new venture and how it relates to the psychedelic space.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So make no mistake, there is a trend moving away from the long-term use of psych meds, moving away from SSRIs and benzos, because there are downstream effects that we are starting to see now early on. And what I love about this conversation with psychedelics is that there is a relatively short treatment path to be able to resolve some of these mental wellness issues. And my company, it's Within Health, we are launching a vagus nerve stimulator for a medical device company. We're launching our first product as a wellness technology, and then we have 2 clinical devices coming down the line. Our technology is a portable vagus nerve and acupuncture point stimulator that helps to inspire wellness by delivering micropulse to the vagus nerve and acupuncture points on the earlobes. For those of you who know what the vagus nerve is or don't know, it's the longest nerve in the body, and it's responsible, it's that superhighway between the organs and the brain, and anything related to your autonomic function, so your breathing, your heart rate, as well as what hormones get secreted at what times from what triggers. And so our technology is something that's really great for inducing calm. It is different than any other wellness technology that's out there. We're launching it as a wellness technology because it is the only technology that is solved for something called hyperpolarization, or that saturation that happens when you're delivering electrical stimulation. It's the only technology that's out there. But we see this, and we've been having conversation with other psychedelics organizations and companies as a bridge for those individuals after they are through with a session. Because what can often happen, depending on the care that's given, you can have these peaks and valleys until you come back for your next CBT session, behavioral session, or your next treatment. And what our technology does is it gives a way for individuals to smooth out those rough patches. It's a very quick treatment, 25 minutes. We see responses within 3 to 5 sessions. And so it's something that can really bridge that gap for individuals who are undertaking that psychedelic therapy.
Great. We're going to take questions, but Avani, go ahead.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Avani Kanubaddi. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer of a small biotech company called Innergia Biosciences. We're actually in the psychedelic space as well. We actually started more traditionally. I started at Pfizer and Bristol Myers, and have worked in the life sciences space my entire career. And I'm very much passionate about this space because we're a patient-centric company. I think we can all agree that mental health is something that has been kind of in the closet for a very long time, and now it's starting to come out. We're seeing athletes and people talking about it. COVID itself is having mental challenges for people who have long COVID. So there's so many areas where we're struggling with this as a society, and SSRIs have been the only option, and they haven't evolved in 30 years, right? They basically have been the same kind of sledgehammer that goes with this problem. And yet we have this very old technology, and indigenous people have been using psychedelics for millennia and seeing benefits. And I think what we do, and we're a biotech company, we're publicly traded, we're on the NASDAQ, and our entire focus is taking what's so great and the inspiration that psychedelics offer and doing what we talked about earlier, which is this Gen 2, we call it Gen 2 and Gen 3. So trying to find ways to modify the molecule to make them better, to have some of those side effects removed, to make it more productive for the patient, and to have it reach more people ultimately. And I think the idea of right now psychedelics, if you take the actual plant or the fungi, it really comes down to it's what we call psychedelic boosted therapy. And I think your comments are right on, which is the therapist is critical to that equation, right? If you can really diagnose at the core what is causing these issues with people, whether it's depression or anxiety, fear, suicidality, it's very deep embedded. Oftentimes it goes back to childhood, or many traumatic events can lead to these issues. And we bury it. That's what we do, right? We push through, we say put on a good face, and we keep fighting. And yet there's that core, there's that festering wound really deep down. And I think what I've been blown away by what I've read and seen, and I've been not as long as you, but I've been in the psychedelic business for like 2 years now, and so much has evolved in that time. And what Enveric does is really bring the science to it, in the sense that we have a lab in Calgary with 20 PhDs, and these individuals every single day wake up and try to invent new molecules that can improve the quality of life of these patients. So we talk about patient centricity. It sounds like a platitude, but it's really true, because when you see how people are suffering, you can find a way to really make a difference, and that's what inspires us every day to get going. And we've been public for 1.5 years. We've raised around $35 million to fund this, and that's just the beginning. I mean, anybody who's been in biotech knows that it's a very expensive and it's a long process, but if we get to where we hope to get to, we think we can make a very, very meaningful difference. And we're not trying to boil the ocean, to use that metaphor, but we're focusing in on one specific area, which is known as CRD, or cancer-related distress. And what that means is, if anybody has seen or gone through a cancer diagnosis, the physical challenges are really what we treat with medicine today. But the psychological aspects of a cancer diagnosis are almost completely forgotten or overlooked. And we've actually broken it down to 3 phases. The day someone gets that devastating diagnosis, during treatment, and in remission. There's a different type of fear, there's a different type of anxiety that comes from each of those stages. And we're working to create molecules and medicines that can work with the patient through that journey and hopefully give them their life back, even though they're going through potentially one of the most devastating days of their life. And Hopkins and NYU and Yale have done some incredible work in areas like CRD, where people who are terminal have a light, they're going to pass away. They go through a psychedelic experience, and they will actually tell you, I'm ready to die, I'm okay. It's literally like, it's heart-wrenching when you think about it. So it's really, it's an amazing space. I'm very moved by what I think the industry is doing, and I'm excited not only that there are investors that are supportive, there are people that are very passionate about it, and I completely agree. It's not just a, hey, let's go get a pill in a bottle and solve the world. It's not going to happen that way. It's a much more nuanced solution, and what Enveric is doing, whether it's through, the drug discovery, we're a drug discovery company, but I think the setting with therapists, critical part of this, talk about medical devices and mechanisms that can help us think about what is a very, very nuanced problem, and to think that you can have a pill in a bottle, Prozac, and sell $12 billion of it, sure, you can, because that's how desperately we need this, but there's a better way, and we hope that over the next several years, I completely agree, I think MDMA will get approved, I think psilocybin will be right on the heels of that with Compass Pathways is 2024. We believe that's going to happen as well, and I think that's great. Those are what is known as classic psychedelics. That's kind of the original source material. Then companies like ours will come along and invent the next generation. And somebody asked a question about IP. We have filed 15 patents that cover millions of molecules, because that's how difficult it is to invent something. And then we've actually had to invent our own AI to sit in front of that to filter those millions of molecules to find the 1 or 2 good ones that are really going to do something. So that's what Enveric is really focused in on, is inventing new molecules, finding them, filtering them, and then going through the entire drug discovery clinical pathway and go through the FDA. So I would agree, do not compare this to CBD or cannabis. It is night and day, because the FDA is far ahead here than anything else, And it will not be a state-by-state regulation issue that we should worry about. It's when a drug gets descheduled, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to take a drug from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. You're going to potentially make it much more accessible. And some people may not even realize the first psychedelic has already been approved. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but J&J, a little company, got a drug approved called Spravato. And Spravato is esketamine, and that drug is on pace to do $3 billion a year already. Like it is an unbelievable need out there for this. So, I'll give the mic back here because there's so much to talk about. I could talk for a long time, but I'll stop here to say that it's a really exciting time, exciting space, and I'm hoping that the industry wins, because then if they do, we all win. So.
Thank you. This is super exciting. As an investor, we want to ask a real quick question of each of them, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, let's do it. So, I mean, I'd love to hear. For me, I like explore teams all day, and I'm not sure if you have your teams here with you, but I won't get too in the weeds of that. I think that what I'd also be really interested to hear with your Ellyn, is that yes, Ellyn. Maybe talk to us a little bit about how you're looking to establish the partnerships to be able to actually roll out the technology that you're building. Do you have partnerships already in place? What does the rollout of the tech look like?
Great. So our inventor of the technology has been in electroceuticals since the 1980s. And so he's got a number of relationships just through his science. He's a Russian scientist that is now American. We also have another founder who is a retired psychoanalyst. And through his network as well, they've deployed this technology and have worked in a number of different medical indications. PTSD, they've actually helped people who've been addicted to ketamine resolve that, which if you don't have the right care path, that can happen. But through those relationships, we've been able to get out. My medical device background in neurostim has, I have relationships in the industry. And so with that, we've been able to form partnerships, not only among clinicians who will be leasing our MVPs that just came off the line about a month ago, but also with foundations. The Chopra Foundation is very interested in our wellness product because of the way it helps to inspire stillness. It's one of those things, it's one of these wellness devices where it works on the person. The person does not need to focus on breathing. They don't need to focus on biofeedback. They don't need to think about the way their heart is beating. It just happens. And so that is a way for people to access meditation. To answer your question, we will launch this both through functional medical doctors, acupuncturists, chiropractors, as well as through some patients. We have a couple of very influential individuals who are very active on social media that we will also do direct to consumer. And that launch will happen at the end of this year and broadly first part of next year.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay. Yeah, and for yourself, I guess one of the questions that we always have for, we have a lot of investors that are super interested in the public side of things, even though we don't invest there. Yeah. And one of the things that we've noticed in psychedelics is that a lot of companies go public quite early. In 2020 we saw dozens and dozens of companies go public through the TSX. You guys are on NASDAQ, so would love for you to just kind of talk me through that thought process. Early stage, drug development company. Why did you guys decide to go the public market route?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. Being public is really, really painful, to be honest. It's expensive. It's time consuming. I mean, I spend a ton of time talking to the NASDAQ and the SEC and filing Qs and Ks, and it's a huge distraction, to be very candid. But in a biotech world, it is a very cost-intensive business. Unfortunately, it's going to take hundreds of millions of dollars to raise to do this. I was mentioning to somebody earlier, when we went public, we actually ended up having to put a shelf in place for $200 million because that's the kind of goals that we have in order to fund these initiatives all the way through. A clinical trial can cost $100 million, right? So you really have to think the long game on this, and I think for us, it was really being NASDAQ was a very big, it was was the goal. Like, we didn't want to be a public company on a peripheral exchange because it's much harder. You still have all the baggage and the difficulty in raising capital when you're not on NASDAQ or NYSE. So we really said, if we're going to do this, we're going to be on NASDAQ, and we met the requirements and we went public. We were able to raise, we have access to capital. That's the best thing, and it actually is the cheapest capital because you have a liquid stock. So we, as a small company, we still transact 2 million shares a day. We have a high liquidity in our vehicle. We have a very strong balance sheet for a small early stage company. So those are the positives. I think the negatives certainly are that it's a distraction from the science. We have to have people like myself who are much more on the business side who do nothing but worry about keeping the company public. And then we have an entire science team who don't even worry about that, and their job is just to go and create great science and great data, because as a biotech company, you really are going to be judged on, I think, 2 things: deals and data. So, there are companies that are starting to invest, and if you have a vehicle, Otsuka, so, company here in Princeton, for anybody who knows, Otsuka invested in a psychedelic company. First big pharma investment into a psychedelic space. When that happened, it was almost a bellwether, because it was a small investment, to be honest. For Otsuka, it was a real small check. But for that company and for the industry, it was really meaningful. And so I think when you think about companies like ours who are on a NASDAQ, on a public vehicle, it gives us access to capital, gives us the ability to fund our research and to hire the best people who can. And also, M&A is going to be a big deal in this space. As I think you pointed out, there's so many little companies that are doing great work. They won't all make it. So companies that have a strong balance sheet and have a currency, your stock is a currency, you can buy companies with stock. So we end up doing that, and I think we hope to be one of the ones that, when that consolidation happens, we'd like to be a net acquirer and start to bring the industry together.
Great, we're going to take lightning questions. That means lightning answers. In as many as possible before the crowds come. So, questions? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so a lot of the conversation I hear around this treatment is it's for treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant that. Is that strategic, or should it be the first line? Because I know the time it takes and the years of aggravation and heartache of figuring out that you're treatment-resistant. So how do we get that to the first line? How can we is there any objective data that you can collect rather than just, I feel better? So kind of twofold question on that.
Yeah, so I could answer the second piece of the question. I'm probably not the best person to answer the first part. Do you want to take a stab at it?
You go first and I'll finish.
Okay. So with being able to kind of collect data and just show outcomes. So just a little bit on the treatment-resistant part. I think that for those who don't know, typically treatment-resistant means after the first few lines of defense, so maybe you're prescribed an SSRI for treatment-resistant depression, etc. You've tried numerous different types of options, and then you have this specific pharmaceutical to be able to use, or the specific treatment to be able to use. So I can't answer quite well the question of why treatment-resistant has been the first to really take it off. I let my drug development expert over there handle all of those questions. But I think that in terms of seeing significant boosts with treatment-resistant, because these are individuals who've had multiple lines of defense against this ailment that have not been able to benefit from different types of treatments. You can basically, draw at least a soft conclusion that if psychedelics, for instance, are really pushing this specific patient population and 80% of it in some cases over the line and actually helping them reduce their mental health ailments, that's a pretty good indication that this thing is going to be helpful for the people who aren't treatment resistant and maybe are benefiting somewhat from SSRIs. But yeah, do you want to add?
Sure. No, that's a good answer. The other way, the reality for a lot of this is the FDA wants to solve the hardest problems, and this is still fringe. Let's not kid ourselves, right? I mean, there's stigma associated with psychedelics. There's a lot of limitations, and these two compounds, MDMA and psilocybin, have been given breakthrough status by the FDA, which means that it's given a faster path to go. So they typically pick up the hardest challenge, and I think that the idea TRD is a really hard. That's really asking to hit the hoop a mile away from here, right? And Compass did that. And when Compass said they're going to go after TRD, that's what they were approved for, that's what their clinical trial was on, we read through, because it was like the clinical trial was like okay results, but they picked the hardest population to actually solve for. So I think it really comes down to the pathway from the FDA to say I want to go after, get breakthrough status for one thing, or orphan designation, if anybody's familiar with that term. It's usually when it's less than 200,000 person population, you can get orphan designation. That's actually what the CBD, if you heard of Epidiolex actually got approved for an orphan condition which affects less than 200,000 pediatric patients in the world, the country, and they got bought out for $7.5 billion because they knew the potential of where that could go to next. So it's really a regulatory strategy in a lot of ways, but you're right, it will go to the next step is TRD leads to depression.
I want to follow up on that. Is there anybody doing any clinical research on first and second line therapy for psychedelics and first and second line?
We'll repeat that.
So you're asking anybody doing on first and second line?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if there are, there are a lot of studies going on right now. There's, lots of early stage work, and the clinical trials are starting to come online here. I still think they're all pretty niche. They're not going after the big bullseye yet for a couple of reasons. One, pharma is standing in the middle of it because they have a lot to lose there. So, we really want to be careful as an industry. I'm sure there's probably pharma execs in here. We're in New Jersey for, So, I think the reality is pharma has a really strong hold in SSRIs, and they're making billions of dollars a year doing it. So I think to your earlier comment, you have to think of the ecosystem collectively. And I think the industry is trying to navigate that very carefully. CBD, candidly, for all of the hype, there's only one approved drug in the world, Epidiolex, that's it. And it actually got approved, its patent is actually very, very narrow. If you're an IP attorney, I'm sure you'd have a field day with this patent because it's super narrow. Like if you could drive right around it, but they had a special breakthrough status which gives them like 7 years of protection. After that, it's going to be wide open. There's going to be generic Epidiolex all day long, and price is going to plummet. This is a different business completely, and because there are so many different source materials, it's not just one, as you said, you've got a lot of material to work with. I think it's going to be a very different track, and it's going to start to slice off, and my sense is once they prove success, including us, in one area, CRD can lead to depression, right? So cancer-related distress can then be expanded through indications into other areas. So that's my guess. I don't know what everybody's doing, but from what I've seen, that's what I've heard.
I'll just add something to that real quickly. So that's exactly right. It's a regulatory strategy, right? There's $1 billion industry around antidepressants. This is one of the reasons, so our technologies will be first and second line treatment for depression and anxiety. Our founder has released a previous technology called the Innerstill device. We won't go to market initially against depression and anxiety. We will go with another indication that will get us through a breakthrough device designation. And so, complete regulatory strategy. One of the reasons why we're bringing our wellness device to market is to get this out into functional medical doctors and to consumers, because it is a great way to help bring about calm and inspire wellness.
Thank you. Next question. Alistair, speaking of pharma,
Yes,
pharma.
speaking of pharma. What are the regulators' attitudes towards risks of addiction?
So we have a lot of research showing for psychedelics, there's extremely low risks of addiction or any sort of habitual habit forming with compounds. Now with ketamine, that was actually probably one of the biggest obstacles, is that ketamine is habit forming. But for a lot of the other traditional psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, they don't really, they're just not habit forming. And for anyone who's had a psychedelic experience, biochemically it's not, but also just, you're not going into a psychedelic experience necessarily having a euphoric experience. You're going into a psychedelic experience having an experience where you get punched in the face and shown the reality of your situation, and coming out having to kind of figure out what you want to do with your life next. And that's not necessarily something people are chasing every day, especially with high dose psychedelics.
It's not just, you're taking a little bit, you're going to an art exhibit, etc. You're taking a pretty high dose, blindfolded, with music playing, and being guided to process some of your deepest traumas. So it's a very different way of working, but even biochemically, we just haven't seen, physiologically, we just haven't seen habit formation from most classical psychedelics.
I would only, one quick, the big thing is, this is never going to be recreational. So I would make a huge distinction with cannabis again. Psychedelics will never be recreational from a medical perspective, and they will always be in a set and setting environment where you have a therapist there for when you have a hallucination. Now, companies like us are working on Gen 3, where you could cleave off the hallucination and see if it still has therapeutic effect, where you could potentially do it that's not necessarily in a set and setting, but that's years away. And I think in addition to ketamine being the one that is very controlled, right? You have to stay there for X number of hours after a treatment, et cetera. But most of these are not considered habit forming, so I think that's fair. But it's also got the extra guardrail that you can't take it outside of a clinic with an expert kind of holding your hand. So.
Because I guess the regulators are extremely burned by what happened to opioids.
Yeah, 100. Well, this has actually been used as the cure for addiction. So it actually is the counterweight to that. But to your point, people are using these recreationally. We know that. The key question is how can you, in a medical sense, control that and you won't have that same issue.
So just like a couple of tiny things to add to it. So the actual issue with ketamine today is that we're seeing a bunch of startups popping up that are like telemedicine focused. And so it's like at-home ketamine delivery where your therapist is online. So it can definitely be problematic. And we've heard from, kind of the grapevine, the FDA is very concerned and it's beginning to look into shutting down some of these operations, which have been some of the biggest revenue generating companies in the space to date that aren't kind of, public drug development companies, but are more infrastructural telemedicine. I think the second piece is I disagree with the claim of it not being able to be recreational ever, and that's actually another kind of conflict within the space of like people having different opinions on this. Some individuals believe it will never be recreational. Personally, I think that what's going to be rolled out is more of a driver license type of system, and this is something that a lot of nonprofits and regulators have been talking about, especially with Oregon, and again, following the policy there has been super informative. But basically, you can use it for recreational use, you just have to go through basically a training to be able to do that. And that will probably happen with psilocybin first, and then as other compounds begin to be descheduled and we find ourselves 15 years down the line, 2035 is when MAPS, which is the biggest nonprofit and the longest standing organization within the psychedelics ecosystem, 2035 is their predictions for when we will see federal recreational legalization of some of these compounds, but still with some of those boundaries in place for like the psychedelic driver's license as they term it.
What do you think it would take to get the NIH to put in more funding to support the R&D work?
So we just saw earlier last year, in 2021, I think, the first NIH grants. So I think it's going to be just a patient game of patience and just having more data come out and having the NIH funding going to these universities, bringing back really great data and results, and that growing. But kind of the seal has been broken. It's beginning to happen. So the NIH is following this very closely, and pretty much every government agency right now is paying attention to psychedelics. It's not something that's like over their heads or happening in the shadows. Every single one has a department that's looking at psychedelics, and our team, as well as the teams that we work with, are in daily conversations with all of these government entities, seeing what it's going to take to push this further in a controlled way. Everyone wants the government's buy-in. People don't want to do this in the back, and there's a lot of, even from the advocacy groups and the nonprofits, people don't want the stigma to continue, and the best way for the stigma to continue is not working with the government, having more accidents happen today, and kind of just letting this out of the box and seeing a lot of the negatives that we may have seen in the 60s and 70s as well. So yeah.
Which is why I think I hope that it doesn't become recreational the way that we're talking about, because the first thing you need is some kid who trips and jumps off a bridge and the entire industry gets shut down. To me, that is the danger that we have here, because these are powerful medicines. Like, let's not kid ourselves. This is not something to mess around with. So maybe you're right, like in 20 years, 15 years it'll happen, but I really hope it doesn't, because I think it needs to be controlled. Otherwise, it hurts the whole industry when you get into it. It's like, opioids, have a benefit, but when misused, they can cause all kinds of harm. So I hear what you're saying. It's just the reality is these are powerful medicines. I wouldn't tell anybody just to go out and like do something without a proper guide, and I've never done it myself, so just so you know. So I mean, it's like I believe in science,
and I've done a lot. So.
you can ask him about how to do it.
By the way, there are electroceutical ways to actually achieve a psychedelic state, something that our guys are working on.
No, and to Ellen's point, there's actually a lot of really interesting tech right now that we're also looking at that's not psychedelic related at all, but still allows for you to accomplish some of the same benefits. Like neurofeedback is one that's super interesting. I was telling Ellen earlier, I keep like a weird EEG device in my backpack and like put it on my head and show people my brain waves and stuff when I go around. There's a lot of really cool technology that can achieve altered states of consciousness or be able to help you visualize your state of consciousness to be able to then adjust it and achieve some of the same benefits that psychedelics have.
I just wanted to add that if any of you are in the area and you want to experience MindVibe, our technology, and track your HRV through it, come find me. I'll be happy to let you try it out.
We can still take a few questions. Chris, go ahead.
Have you found ways to leverage indigenous knowledge of use, safety, and efficacy of psychedelics? You want to just talk about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, like when we have, and we don't get asked these questions in every space we go to, right? Like a lot of the times we're, in spaces that have never interacted with indigenous community members or even know what that is. But yeah, so for those who may be less aware, indigenous communities all across the globe have been using psychedelics in community settings for healing for thousands of years. Some plant medicines are newer, some are far older, but these traditions have been going on for thousands of years, and so there is a lot that we can learn from indigenous communities. For instance, the use of song and the use of music that manifests in the Peruvian Amazon, the Shipibo, are an indigenous tribe there, and they're kind of the stewards, some of the main stewards of ayahuasca, which is a plant medicine that a lot of people have heard more of. So for us, we're also very closely paying attention, just like we're paying attention to policy to understand how things evolve, we're also really closely paying attention to indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities, not only the lessons to be learned, but also what does reciprocity look like and how do we actually interact with indigenous communities to be able to give back. And there's some very, very interesting and innovative projects about how do we actually take the proceeds that are resulting from $1 billion, billions and billions dollar industry and being able to feed them back into indigenous communities that steward the lands which produce these plants and then actually do the ceremonies that have provided the teachings to be able to build this entire ecosystem on top of. There's a famous Life magazine article from 1957, I believe, and that kind of broke open the doors for psychedelics in the West. That only happened because of Maria Sabina in Mexico leading Westerners on psilocybin treks. So this knowledge is clearly derived from indigenous practices, and where we are today wouldn't be possible. So how do we give back through that process as well?
But she was considered a traitor, right, to her community?
She was, exactly, when she invited people, right, and it ended extremely poorly for her. Tourism, and it brings out a lot of other discussions. Tourism began, so there's a lot of psychedelic tourism right now in Peru and in other places with shamanic healing, which can destroy economies during the COVID crisis. There's been significantly more nonprofits that have fallen, indigenous communities that have lost power. But again, if you guys are interested in projects that specifically work with indigenous communities, give indigenous communities power over the early stages of the supply chain, sustainably grow ayahuasca, create NFTs out of the artwork, and there are so many interesting, fascinating, high-tech biotech projects that are happening right now in tandem with indigenous communities that are the stewards of psychedelic treatment and medicine. So super fascinating stuff. Find me, can talk for days.
And I should note, I was reminded by Bruce Malloy, who's here, about the benefits. I was also reminded by Ronan Levy, one of Mary's colleagues, about the benefits of psychedelics for creativity and innovation. We sort of benefited from Steve Jobs of the world and the 60s and 70s and all that. We don't realize it, but when one day it becomes more prevalent, we will benefit from the creativity that is yielded from some of these experiences. So I'm very personally excited about that prospect because nothing is more important to our future, our economy than creativity and innovation. So any other questions before we go ahead and
you talked about the regulatory strategy. Can you talk a little bit about the reimbursement strategy, and especially around off-label use? How tight is that going to be, and how is that sort of being played? It's forward-looking, but.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's part of, we're probably not, it's still a little early for that because we're still trying to characterize the drug and we're trying to get it to a point where it is a safe and effective compound. But when early conversations are going to be around, this is I think you mentioned it earlier, this is not like a lifelong thing. You don't have to take this forever. And if anybody who's ever been on an SSRI, there's an onboarding period. It takes months to get your base dose. And then to get efficacy can have a lot of side effects. We've actually seen with one treatment of psilocybin, people feel like they're okay. And I'm not gonna say cured, they feel that they can handle their life. And so it's actually quite fascinating in that. So the regulatory and the reimbursement strategy is gonna be a little bit novel because there's a therapist involved, there's medicine involved, there's recurring treatment involved. So there's a complicated kind of, a riddle to solve there. I don't think anybody's gotten far enough to even have conversations with the FDA yet or insurance companies. But because most of our folks are, GSK, J&J, Pfizer, BMS, we come from a world where we look down that far, but we don't have the answers yet to have that conversation. So at least that's from us. So.
Do you want to say? There actually is already psychedelic reimbursement. A company called Energia has been working on this for years, probably since I started. It was actually the main underwriter of the MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy. But anyone who wants insured psychedelic-assisted therapy can go work for Dr. Bronner's today, the soap company, and they can have their psychedelic-assisted therapy covered. And this was just announced in I think early December of this past year. So it's beginning to show up, and I know that company specifically, it's actually a nonprofit now, is working with many other companies to begin rolling out insured psychedelic-assisted therapy. So the roots are there; it's growing.
Well, it's Spravato is reimbursed. Spravato is reimbursed, and even though ketamine is considered a dissociative, it's actually an anesthetic, right? So if you know, ketamine is actually started as an anesthetic, but so they do get reimbursement. It's pretty lucrative as it is today, but it needs a nurse to administer it. So that's why it's a multifaceted approach.
Great. Well, this has been, I know a lot of you are going to rush up here asking questions. I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to thank Mike, thank McCarter for hosting us. Before we leave, you guys can hang out for as long as you like. If you want tickets, let me know. I'm excited about this show. This has been really informative, really interesting. I want to thank you again. Before we go, I just want our thoughts and prayers to go out to all those, in the war right now that's going on. I just learned that Marik his family's from Crimea, and Marie is also from that part of the world as well, from Bulgaria, and just take a pause before we grab a drink to send our thoughts and prayers to not only all of those millions of people affected, but all the refugees in this planet, more than 50 million. Our hearts go out to them as well. So thanks again for coming. Have a great weekend.